half a minute.
Hello.
So hi again. I wanted to ask, if I switch off the comments, then your face would be seen better, but we won't see who joins or who says hello. But I think it would be better to switch them. What do you think?
As you wish.
Or are you fine with your face blocked a bit by comments?
I'm sure if people say smart things, I'll be very happy to have them all over me.
Yes. Well, I'll leave them. So yes, we are starting. Greetings from St. Petersburg and telebridge to Paris. My first question is, you're quite unique in a way that you have been born to a multicultural family, and then your education and your upbringing led you to get to know many cultures. Your CV features 4 languages proficiency and 4 languages written, and you have worked as a translator. And I'm quite fascinated by this because it actually connects to many of your other occupations that you do. So I was wondering if you could tell us about your youth, how did you come to be this multicultural man?
Well, I don't know if the biographical details are extremely interesting to people, but certainly growing up with 2 parents who came from different countries and who spoke different languages to me has been a very, very important and beautiful experience. And I guess it comes with some amount of code switching, as the linguists say. And I don't know, maybe not a desire, but a habit of switching between worlds and languages in the broadest sense. So it is maybe not a coincidence that I find myself comfortable in a place where I work with people from different trades, work on performances that combine artistic languages, and also that, of course, that I work as a translator. Those are, I think that's a very interesting place to be. And I don't know if it's a comfortable place, but maybe it's a discomfort I find comfortable.
Do these things come naturally to you, or do you think it's maybe a feature of a young person of today, that everybody is like you, or do you think you're special in being able to connect to so many cultures at once?
I don't know. I mean, obviously, there's the other side of that narrative is that someone who is considered to be between cultures is considered to not fully belong to any one of them. So many would say that is you create a very selective and an incomplete relationship to any culture at all. So, but yeah, maybe there's some amount of superficiality, but I don't know. I think it is an interesting right to underline that it has something to do with the world, how the way the world is today. We need tools to understand what multiculturality means, what it means to grow up with different backgrounds, trying to find your own place between different backgrounds, and the old notions like identity and so on that used to be considered in a very monolithic way, certainly not the most interesting way to understand the world today. So that's why I find this position interesting, that I'm entertaining it rather than trying to put my roots in one specific place. I do think that from that position, you can talk about the world in a very specific way. But that is not by no means something that makes me special, because, as you noted, a lot of people, more and more people, have a multicultural background, and people who don't have a multicultural background per se also have many cultures they need to navigate.
And you also, in a way, well, it's not similar to mine, but I was really surprised by some similarity, that you first did a BA in philosophy and only then decided to switch, well, not to switch, but to add a theater to your education. And I'm wondering what feeds on what then? I mean, are you a philosopher who then became a theater director? Like, how do you feel these educations, these choices are now formed structurally, prioritized in your, say, in your profession and in your way of looking on the world?
I don't know. Maybe it's just the French habits that we like talking about things,
Mm-hmm.
and that it's very helpful to talk about things. Maybe sometimes we talk about them too much, but it's it is always a very critical moment in the rehearsal room, because everyone happens to be put together in one room and they have to make a project together, and we're wondering, so what is this project about? And we start talking and we talk and talk, and then sometimes we forget that we're actually supposed to make a show. And I think actually philosophy is not something that entertains that bad habit. It's something that fights against it, because
So if you do talk, you have to talk in a philosophical way, in a nicely structured way, then. No?
well, I don't know if it's about structure. I think it's about the impulses. When you philosophy, I mean, certain types of philosophy teach you to first and foremost how to ask questions, and I think the first part of an artistic process is asking yourself the right questions.
Mm-hmm.
You can create a lot of work without asking yourself any question at all, and then usually it doesn't answer any question.
So you began with being an assistant director, right? To
Well, yeah,
Peter Sellers, yes, in Santa Fe, and to I don't remember exactly. Sorry, the name of the woman director also, yeah.
Sahame Adel, yeah, she was the first director I worked with in my
Mm-hmm.
19 years.
So could you briefly describe what assistant director does and how did it help you afterwards? Well, of course, Peter Sellers then also became the subject of your PhD that you're still writing. So it seems to be a quite important figure through your life. So maybe you could
Mm.
talk, connect working with him with your decision then to work on him.
Mm. Well, the assistant director is, I mean, it's a job title, and it's usually someone who does a lot of very useful things in a
Mm-hmm.
production, because there's so much a director can do when they're working on something complex. But I cannot say that I have been someone especially proficient as an assistant director. It was in both cases because I had only those two experiences of being an assistant. It was more about mentorship.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of Peter Sellers, it was more about having conversations about books that we would both read and that he would buy and give me to read overnight. It was more about that than about making photocopies and of rehearsal schedules and that kind of stuff. So I certainly didn't learn. I mean, I learned a lot from watching, and I think that's anyway. That's the most useful thing you can learn as an assistant when you want to be a director, since but the main thing that the director does all day is watch other people and try to understand how he can be helpful, and not an embarrassing presence.
Well, could you describe him as a personality and why did you decide later to research him? Well, we know that his legacy is huge, but what was your decision behind it?
Well, I think the first contact with the work of Peter Sellers is always something pretty mind-blowing in many ways, because it has that quality that great works of art have, that they broaden your perspectives in a huge way. As you can imagine, the audience of Shakespeare's plays in London in the early 17th century, and people who hearing suddenly about places like the ancient Rome, or about Vienna, about Norway, and so on, or the first time Beethoven's symphonies were performed. They're just works of art that open windows on the complexity and or even just more simply the vastness, the hugeness of the world. And Peter Sellers just packs so much into his performances. He's taking works that span the entire repertoire, Greek tragedies, Baroque operas, things that you would think are something ancient or unrelated. And then he will be interested in the Mexican culture, he'll be interested in Japanese culture, and all those things will come together and make you realize what a huge, complex world of interconnectedness we're living in. And I think, yeah, I was just very interested when studying him by how to create such art. I think it comes from a very pragmatic place. There's very unanswerable question that we all have when we start studying with the eye of someone who wants to make it, the art of other people. But just wondering, how is it made? And obviously there is no answer. You can scratch a painting as much as you want. You're not going to find a secret of a good painting. You're just going to find a canvas.
Is it where the source of your interest in music being a spectacle, the connection between music and image comes from? Because then you also wrote several works on this topic too.
Yes, well, I think that was one of the fundamental questions that I wanted to ask myself when working with all these people that have different traits, that have different crafts, and that try to create a project together. So obviously there's something that's a dialogue between art forms that are very different, but there's also a component of essential fundamental unity. And because we are only able to talk together because there's something we share, even if it's very basic or very something deep down in the structures. And all traditions or moments in history when people have wanted to create interdisciplinary art, they have been having this fantasy of creating narratives about how arts used to be joined, conjoined, and have been separated in history and have to be reunited again. When Monteverdi created opera, when Gluck reformed opera, when Wagner created lyrical drama, they were all fantasizing about Greek tragedy. And of course, in each case, it was a delusion. They had very limited information about what Greek tragedy looked like. But that fantasy was driving them. They was thinking that there was a time, like a golden age or something, where dance was music, which was theater, which was poetry. And all those things were joined, and we could actually create something that was not universal, it's an ugly word, but something that was common, that was shared, which is the fundamental question of living together in one city, in one place, having one culture.
But isn't this goes contrary to modern research, which says that, however we try to perceive the work kind of in one, we are attuned, some are attuned more to visual perception, some are attuned more to audio perception, and also it would depend on a person's background. If they don't, say, read poetry, they wouldn't get any quotes or any connections that were in there. So do the audiences kind of answer the expectations of such a synthesis of arts? What do you think? Like, do they perceive it in its wholeness?
Well, that's the thing. That's what the beauty is that when you go watch a straight play where everything relies on dialogue, then you can set yourself a very modest goal, which is that people understand situations based on dialogues because they speak the language and they have conversations, so they know what a conversation is supposed to look like. And so then you can say at the end of the play, you can say that they have most people have reached 100% understanding. But of course, that's not how the world works. That's not the way the world works in the first place. We have limited understanding of everything. So I'm not saying we should look for obscurity, that we should necessarily make art that's ununderstandable to anyone. But we can't speak to everyone as if everyone was one voice or one person. What we have to do, and that's the challenge of politics, the challenge of life together, is how do we speak not to everyone but to each one. And for that, I don't believe in synthesis, in the idea that we'll just put all the arts together and we'll create a perfect mixture that has a little bit of this, a little bit of that. On the contrary, we'll create an object that's complex because it has many layers, many facets, many dimensions. And in that case, there's something there to hang on for everyone. And so everyone will have the possibility to just find that little thread that they're more familiar with, or that they feel more comfortable following, and they will pull that string and they will find their own way through the work. And I think that's the only solution, because otherwise you're not speaking to everyone when you make a unified work of art. You're speaking to the people who have their codes to understand that specific convention. Opera, as we understand it, as we see it in opera houses most of the time, is not a universal art form. It's an extremely specific art form that's extremely codified in a certain way. It's by no means universal.
Well, speaking about opera, when you were only 19 or 20, you directed Wozzeck with the Philharmonia and Esa-Pekka Salonen, right? So it's such an achievement at such an early age. Could you describe it? It also has a chorus, and it's one of the most difficult operas, I think, in the repertoire. But yes, that's not a question for you as the director, but still, how did it go? Was it easy for you as such a young person to establish your vision? And what was your experience of working with the conductor, with the orchestra, with the chorus, and presenting your vision of work?
Oh, it was doing Wozzeck with Philharmonia was a great crash test to understanding what it's like to work in opera in general. I mean, it's a blessing to work on that opera specifically, which is one of the greatest masterpieces. And I mean, it's just such wonderful theater. We inside the music, through the music. And but basically it was like a quick move. It was creating a staging inside a concert setting in a very limited time. So it was basically about being prepared and trying to understand what the constraints were. There was like this there was 1 meter of depth in front of the orchestra, and everything had to happen in that stripe in front of the orchestra, and integrating the orchestra as a landscape, as a commenter, as it is in the piece. And so it was not an instance of creating a project as we do usually, as we try to do, but we'll talk about that later. It was really about trying to see how much you can create in the most limited situation, theater-wise. It was not a limited situation artistically because the musical level was just so high. So to have such great performers, such a great conductor as Pekka Salonen. But what was really fascinating was that basically there had to be a staging for an hour and a half of music after 2 rehearsals. So trying to understand, how do you create something cohesive? How do you create an actual artistic experience when you basically can't work at all and with people, but you have to be extremely efficient to create a sense that this is a team, that create a sense that these people are telling a story together. That was really fascinating. I wouldn't call it my greatest artistic achievement, which is fortunate because it was a long time ago, but it was definitely a formative experience.
So from that time, as I understand, you were doing many things. On one hand, you were doing many things individually. You were preparing talks, you were speaking yourself at conferences, you were translating, writing, and then it marks 2010, right, or 9 marks the start of La Chambre aux Échos, your company with Clément. And firstly, could you describe how did you fit all these activities into your life, and actually how do you structure them? Do they come, did the projects with La Chambre come after another? And then how did you develop your own career in parallel, or like basically what was your life structurally in this last 10 years? And who are you in your own view of yourself?
Okay, this is becoming a very big question.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I think all artists started a little bit in the same way, that we start doing things with people we meet and we start enjoying it and we learn as we do these things. And when I met Clément, it was Clément Mautakac, a conductor. At the time, we were just both very eager to do a lot of things. We had so many ideas, and ideas, of course, are very beautiful in people's heads when they are on the ideas, and they are a great motivator. We started working. We started at the time. The first place where we started presenting our project was a hospital in Paris that had a small performing space, and it was. We were really eager to have an arena, a place where we could just present things. And what was beautiful is that it's when you're working in that environment, you're working for people who either are sick, are very ill, or their families, people who are not there for the arts, who are not the critique audience with their notebooks on the labs. No offense intended to you as a writer, but people who are hungry for some kind of spiritual experience, and that performance space was also next to a small chapel. And we really started with a couple of friends, and Clément playing the piano and me taping lighting fixtures with duct tape. They weren't extremely sophisticated performances, technically speaking, but we're experimenting with the idea that how do we meet an audience that has a hunger for art, even if they don't know it, even if they don't know that it's art they want.
I have noticed, to be honest, I even don't know many of the authors that are featured in your performances, Les Chambres Échos. What I'm saying that it has become your trademark to choose not mainstream authors, and kind of to make the montage of texts that are not like relatively unknown somehow. And then also with this, you also choose the works of famous composers like Kaya Sariaha, and you also had La Voix Humaine by Poulenc. So could you describe how do the repertoire choices for La Chambre aux Échos present themselves, and do you have to look for this unknown texts, or somebody gives them to you? How do these unusual projects come about?
Well, I think that's one of the riches that there are in a creative dialogue like the one we have with Clément, and that was our starting point. Anyways, it was conversations. It was the idea that we want to have a real conversation, that we don't want just an ensemble or a theater company and both of them merging, that we want a music theater company that is led together by a conductor and a director.
Mm-hmm.
And so those conversations, they are about all sorts of things, but sometimes it's also very concretely Clément coming, showing me a score and saying, "How do you know this music? This is wonderful music." Or me handing him a text that he doesn't know. And the conversation starts there, and then the act of combining them comes from intellectual necessity, that we feel that that conversation needs to be continued and that it needs to be shared, not through what we have to say about it, of course, but because it's a conversation with immense voices, and of course some of them are unknown. And sure, I would say that there is some kind of purpose in not necessarily always performing the same works.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm sure we always find something wonderful to experience in Traviata, but the ability that work has to comment on our world is rather limited. It's not that there is one other work that is so much better at commenting on our world. It's that we need a diversity of work, of words, of diversity of points of view, of diversities of ways of seeing the world.
Mm-hmm.
And we have that even just by having someone play an instrument and someone else sing a text, of course, but we have it also by multiplying our sources, deciding that we want to hear different types of voices. And those are voices from different times, for different countries.
Mm-hmm.
And usually there are reasons why we haven't heard them more. And those reasons are not that their quality is poor.
And I would also say that you yourself, the position of the company is also in representing a new voice, as we discussed it in Paris, remember, in between, like, in the world of institutions and more, say, mainstream, more established houses and theaters and operas. So even the existence of the company is also an example of being a new voice.
Sure.
In the sphere of music and theater.
Sure. I mean, of course, being chronologically a new voice doesn't mean that you are a new voice in what you have to say.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of you can be a new voice and be an awful conformist, or you can be a new voice and just want to be the old voice and create an entire career around that.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's not the point. I mean, new for the sake of new is a limited goal, but definitely I think plurality, diversity, in the sense, of course, of hearing the voices of communities, but not only, even just the biodiversity of the world we live in, our life, the nature of health is based on how many species of organisms are actually living in the same environment as you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would like to talk about your staging of a Graal theater, which is a violin concerto.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually, you describing how you worked on this would actually somehow be a real example of your thesis that music is an image, right? Because you had music and you had to create an image where the words were not supposed to help you.
Mm.
So could you describe how you did it?
Well, that's an interesting example because it certainly is not an opera that we put on the stage. It's really started from a conversation with the violinist Peter Herrestal, a great Norwegian violinist who wanted to play the concerto, but thought that there should be another dimension to it. Then he was thinking of visual dimension, and what's really interesting is that, of course, he had no idea what it could be. And he didn't want to add a layer to make it fancy or more special. He wanted to add something that would make the experience more complete, because he's someone who performs a lot of new music, mostly, if not only new music. And he really wants to get the music through to people. And sometimes just coming there in your shiny shoes doesn't do that job. And that I emphasize extremely important, because any moment where there has been something that happened in the history of how music is presented to audiences through theater, it always happened because of the invitation of the musicians. It's always the same thing. It has been the same thing when Gustav Mahler was the director of the Opera of Vienna. It was the case with the Kroll-Oper. It was the case with the Komische Oper and all the great institutions that renewed opera as an art form. And Clément is also that kind of musician, the musician who opens the gate, who accepts that not as a concession, but as an act of welcome, that when you create an interdisciplinary performance, a collaboration, it's not going to be just someone who comes and sets some nice visuals and you do your job as usual as a musician. It's going to be a disturbance in a frightening and beautiful sense. If I'm going to work with a musician, the musician's job is going to be very different. It's going to be a very different rehearsal process and a very different performance circumstance. And not all musicians are willing to welcome that frightening, invasive notion that we're going to create something together, not just next to each other. And Peter had that vision too, and we started experimenting for a long while. First, I did a version where I was really just working with projections and lighting, and then we realized that it didn't work. That I couldn't squeeze theater out of the performer in that circumstance, because he was trying to do something extremely hard, which is as complicated as being a dancer, as technical, as precise. I was trying to play that piece. So our idea with Clément and with Peter was to add a stranger into the piece, someone who has no purpose there originally. We added an actor, our collaborator Thomas Kellner, the great German actor, and so the stakes became really interesting, because the whole question was, what is that actor doing in a violin concerto? There's no reason to be there. And we could workshop with Thomas and experiment with different kinds of text. We'd take different texts, and just like shout them over the music and see what happened. And the result of that process was that I wrote the text, and I worked with I made the proposals to Kaya, whose concerto it was after all. So she had a word to say about it. And the whole question, the question I had was very technical. Would you mind if we added a fermata on this place? What about if this texture here continued a little bit so that someone can talk over it? And the actor served exactly what his purpose is, which is to squeeze a place for himself in the middle of the music and be that commentator. And that the whole piece is based on the form of the piece is based on the marginalia, on the drawings that monks would paint in the margins of the manuscripts that they were that they were copying, which are really crazy images, writing these sacred or profound philosophical texts, and they make these paintings of rabbits riding snails, or demons and animals, sometimes extremely sexual images. And so trying to understand what that margin was, what that thing that has nothing to do there was, became the center of the piece, actually. And yeah.
Well, that's a fascinating way to present it. And now we have time, I think, to turn to the work that people can see. À la Passion de Simone, it's now can be watched in French with either English or Finnish subtitles, yes, and it's open to watch now. And so from the director point of view, now you didn't have to invent any characters, because it was an oratorio, and actually you made it into a chamber opera, yes? So how did you work then, and who and how, as you say, you don't like somebody being on the top of the hierarchy, so it was again a collaboration between a composer, a conductor, you, and singers. And could you describe your vision of it? How what were the challenges of this production?
Well, it was the piece was made. I mean, it's not the same kind of collaboration with a composer as when you are writing together or something, or that the writing is in process, which is also something that we love, and that with composers, being in a room with them. But this was a little different. It was, the score was there. Of course, the composer was available physically, but mainly it was the score was there, and it had been performed. We knew that music, and in that case, the score is lying there like an unopened invitation. Because basically, it is an invitation. There's a list of people who should be there when you open the score, and it's basically saying that, will you join my party? And there will be all these people here, and you can contribute to the guest list and make it a really nice party. And that's basically what happened. We decided to answer that invitation with Clément and to create our team, a team of people. There are 19 musicians, I mean instrumentalists. There's one solo singer, there are four, a vocal ensemble of four, and then there's one actor. And and then of course we count everyone backstage from our team. It was a team of 30 people. It was our biggest project when we premiered it in 2013. And back then it was also it wasn't so long after the piece had been performed for the first time. So it was, what was really liberating is that it wasn't an opera. It wasn't written like this guy comes in and goes to the left and he's dressed in this and this way. But it doesn't mean that it's not an opera in a spiritual sense, of course, because basically the form is based on Bach's Passion plays. It's the hero of the Matthäus Passion is not the Christ. He's someone has been talked about, and he has some very beautiful arias, but he's basically just standing there, and there's a halo of strings playing, and it's very beautiful, but it's not about a human experience. What's about the main character is the evangelist. It's the guy who's telling the story and suffering so much about what he sees, suffering from seeing another person in pain, and taking that form to apply to the life of Simone Weil, the philosopher that this opera is about. That was just a stroke of genius, because this is a story of someone who wanted to identify with human suffering, who wanted to understand it from the inside in order to be able to fight it. And so the main character is not Simone Weil, it's a young woman and that creates a lot of freedom, because that person is just a person who is right here, right now with us as an audience, and who is going to go through the life of this person with us.
Yeah. Um, well, we talked with Clement. He presented how the opera is structured. So I'm just wondering whether we would be repeating it again here. What I wanted to ask you, do you, maybe a theoretical question, do you think you belong to a certain school of opera direction, and can you trace your own development? Because you are a, a theoretical person as well as a practical one, so you definitely should know where you belong in comparison to your colleagues.
Mm. Well, I don't know exactly what the schools are, and if there are, if those schools exist, whether anyone wants to be in them. But what was really interesting is in studying Peter Sellars was that there's something so syncretic about him. So someone like Peter Sellars does something that I find very admirable in that he brings together very different traditions. He connects traditions that normally don't really speak to each other. The tradition, for instance, the tradition of Brecht, which is reputed to be extremely intellectual, but that is also a tradition of opera, of the central pleasure of music, of entertainment, in the sense that it's that we connect with people through humor. And such a tradition, he could, so Peter Sellars can connect with a tradition of theater as ritual, the tradition of Antonin Artaud, for instance. The idea that that all types of the tools of theater are vibrations, the musical vibration, the vibration of light, and that you have an influence on the audience through those vibrations, that you can play the audience like an instrument. It's a beautiful idea, but it feels so opposite to some other ways of doing theater. And I think that it's not that you just create a syncretism and mishmash everything into something that is not one or the other, that you need to create your own tradition. And anyways, there's no pure tradition transmission line. I mean, I know that there have been people who have been trying to perform the productions of Stanislavski over and over again over years without changing a single detail. But that's not exactly how theater is made, really, right? It's still people, each day it's still people in the room who are having a conversation about, why are we doing this? Are we doing this right? So in the end, I don't, I mean, I'm inspired by a lot of people, by a lot of things, but I also am aware that inspirations and influences are usually, like any form of conversation, based on a misunderstanding, like the case of people of Wagner thinking that he knew everything about Greek tragedy and creating something that he thought looked like it, or the sculptors of the Renaissance. They thought that Greek sculptures were white and this so pure and beautiful, and so they imitated that and they created the Italian Renaissance, which was not a small thing in the history of art. But now we know that the Greek sculptures were painted with very, very bright colors, that they were not white at all. The whole thing was a complete misunderstanding. And most of the time, when we're influenced by things, we just use transitional objects. We just look at things and see what we want to see in them, and they help us find our own voice.
And in a way, here you're also a meditator, because you are relatively young, and you, I mean, young, yes, just young, and you belong to, actually, still to the generation that we could say, I don't know, maybe that is not connected to Brecht, Chekhov, Stanislavski. It's your own effort to get this connection with the past, right? So, and then you also read newspapers, talk to your friends, and see the modern reality of the last 30 years in front of you. So, which time do you think you belong more? Do you think that you are somehow older than your generation, and you have better connections with the traditions of the past, or on the contrary, you maybe have a vision of the future that nobody has, and you try to modernize the opera and set a tradition?
Well, I think we all work with very different types of influences, and the only thing that makes a difference is whether you are aware of it or not. And a lot of people just think they're making their art, and that's personal, without being aware that they're actually being influenced by all sorts of things, by an establishment, by just habits. That's what Gustav Mahler also said. What you call tradition is just your laziness. uh, and you shouldn't. And he also says you shouldn't be you shouldn't be tending to the ashes. You should be tending to the fire. And so I guess I'm not sure we can rethink in terms of traditions. Just trying to stay critical towards my own bad habits and the bad habits of the people I work with that affect me directly, without being preachy, and trying to always keep their mind open about the essential questions. Are we actually asking the right questions here, and are we giving any satisfying answers to them? Because at the end, that's the only thing that counts, right? We just try to just try to keep a conversation alive. Maybe that conversation is an old tradition, I don't know, but usually traditions and the places where they are kept are not places where questions are asked very often.
And what are the sources of your mind boosts and inspirations? So you suddenly think, yes, I've got this breakthrough into this new field, and I can start answering a new question. Is it intuitive? Is it foreign trips? Is it going inside yourself or reading the books? What is your way of being open to these new things?
But I think anything works because it's just about keeping the conversation open. I was just rereading the ending of Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, and she is making throughout the book, actually, which is a pretty heavy volume in 3 parts, she makes the point that the essential mechanism of totalitarianism is that it's atomization, as she calls it. It's that people stop talking to each other. And she's making this connection, which is very topical in this time of social distancing versus physical distancing. Or are we doing both or either? Which is the idea that there is a difference between solitude and desolation. The solitude is the mind being able to be by itself and being able then to start conversations with other people. Whereas desolation is the atomized mind. It's the mind that's not able to actually have a conversation. And without conversation, there's no individuation. You can think about yourself, and when you think, you start playing different roles and defending different positions and to try to sort it out in your head. But in the end, you do need that other person to talk to. So to feed, of course, for the input, to know what to have a richer point of view. But at the end of the day, mostly to decide who you are. That's when you start talking with someone who thinks something, then at the end of the conversation, you have realized where you stand. And to have that kind of conversation is extremely important these times, of course, because otherwise we'll just all go crazy in different corners.
Yeah.
But and I think this transition to your next question, but it's very important that we make the difference, that you can be lonely, you can be isolated and still be connected through discourse. But if you're not and part of that bigger conversation, you forget who you are yourself, and then nothing that matters anymore. That's a pretty important part of making art, is keeping that conversation alive, and it's very important thing to do in this time that we're living through now.
Can you talk to us, if you can, about the project where you were the author of the libretto, Kaya Sariaho's opera, which I think was supposed, yes, to be premiered at Aix-en-Provence, but I'm not sure yet whether they have cancelled.
Oh yeah, the festival Dex has been cancelled. They announced that yesterday. Well, I'm not at all the author of the libretto. Actually, it's a collaboration first and foremost between Sophie Oksanen, the Finnish writer, and Kaija Saariaho. And in that conversation between them, they sound a little obsessed with conversations. I was asked in first as a dramaturg and an advisor to discuss what the possibilities are, because both of them wanted to do something that they had never done before. And of course, I didn't know what it was supposed to be, but as just to translate a little bit between text and music and stage, and see, we could discuss about what the possibilities of opera as a form could be. And how could we combine spoken text, sung text, everything in between, the possibility of storytelling on a stage, to create a work that's very contemporary. And then I also worked as a translator for the libretto, which is which is sung in 9 different languages.
Are you feeling good in this role, in showing two great artists, in what could be done in between their visions? Like it seems like a strange but interesting position to be helping to connect these big ships, almost like a bridge. Yes?
Well, it's basically what you do all the time as a director. You're just someone who's watching other people work, and great artists who have been working years and years to get to the best level, and you're just a guy sitting there, or a woman sitting there, and looking at them and saying, maybe you should do it a little different. And of course, most of the time people are like, why are you talking to us? Well, who are you to say anything about anything we do? And I kind of enjoy the position, which could call, in a vulgar way, being the pain in the ass, which can be a pleasant pain in the end, or a constructive one at least. Then there is the possibility to have that outer output, outer input, that you actually talk about what's happening from place of being outside. We come back to the marginalia, or the position of the narrator in the Passion de Simone. Starting from the center is usually opening the door to a lot of misconceptions about what's really happening, I think. Just being on the outside and bring that outside perspective of things is a pretty interesting way to go. And so I'm not by no means claiming that I'm more competent than all the other people in the room. On the opposite, all the people who come to a rehearsal room or to a meeting in the preparation of a project are highly skilled people. Like the equivalent of the best athletes in their categories, or the best boxers, the best dancers, the best surgeons. And then
but how do you know that in interfering you wouldn't ruin the structure? How to make sure that you will introduce a new balance rather than spoil the party, so to say?
Well, nobody knows that. But it's just that somehow a conversation keeps going. That's maybe the motto at the end of this night. That and the conversation keeps going, rather than it being about people saying, this is what I'm going to do. Are you okay with that? Okay, let's keep going. Which is something that happens usually in a lot of concert situations, but not necessarily in chamber music, when the more refined conversation can happen. Like the conversation between a conductor and a director in opera houses can be very dull, because everything is organized in a way that they don't exist.
Ah.
that they don't have to talk to each other. That it's very clear what rehearsal is being conducted by whom and so on. The a very unsatisfying relationship, but it's being branded as the meaning of the Titans, and this director and this conductor, they're going to make sparkles together. The thing is that they don't even talk at the canteen of the opera house, let alone in rehearsal. It's storytelling. It's like when both our countries, Russia and Finland, made what they called the Treaty of Friendship at the beginning of the Cold War. Družba. They called it friendship, which was basically don't step on my toes, I won't step on your toes. Don't go too much with the other guys, and I won't go too much with the other guys, and we can be friends. But that kind of friendship is, of course, I'm very glad that I don't have that kind of relationship with the people I call my friends.
Well, actually, to finish, we can be cut off any minute now. So actually, my final question would be, would you describe to us how you are keeping your real everyday, well, not real, virtual everyday conversations with people, with your friends scattered in the world, in Europe, going? And what is your routine, your way of not going mad in these times?
Well, again, I would say keep the conversation going. And it's great. It's what's beautiful is that in times of great distress and loneliness and desolation, people feel the need to talk more, and that they express that. And I'm perhaps prepared in a sense that I spend a lot of my time in isolation normally, and still have to create conversations and keep talking with people normally, because that's what happens. Director spends 5% of his time in rehearsal, actually physically with people. The rest of the time you're preparing, you're coordinating, you're reading and writing to people, and getting angry emails and writing angry emails and that kind of stuff. So I think this is a great time also for people to when they have the chance. More than half of the people still have to live lives as usual, but not as usual, in horrible conditions, take horrible risks not to lose their jobs and to be able to sustain themselves. So it's a minority, actually, that has our privilege of talking in front of our bookshelves.
Books.
But it's a time for those who can do that to take a step back and have that kind of solitude that Hannah Arendt is talking about, a solitude that is about how you're going to enter the conversation and remember who you are, and rethink about asking the right questions. What are the questions that you can ask that will actually make a difference? When you walk into a room and ask a question, is it going to fall flat? Is it going to be completely useless, or is it actually going to change the mood in the room, or is it going to change the terms of the conversations that are ongoing? I think basically we're just these very annoying people, we the artists, to just walk into the rooms with people having fun and shout out questions and maybe kill the mood, or maybe just take the night into a more interesting and not necessarily less fun direction.
Well, let's finish here so that we take the move that not Instagram blocks us, but we stop our talk on our personal decision, like that we are not stopped by the technology. So greetings from St. Petersburg.
Greetings from Paris.
Thank you so much for joining me, and we'll be in touch through the means of conversation.
Yes,
thank
you for inviting me into your
talk,
your studio.
Studio, yes.
And this